Hello, future educators. Welcome back. Today we're talking a little bit about the social goals of schooling. So, first, some definitions. Now, my daughter wants to go to school to play with her best friend. But when we're talking about social goals of schooling, we're actually talking more about schooling and society. Um, Basically, the sociology of education, how schooling prepares kids to be in society. Now, part of that is being friends. And many of you, in your why should I send my kids to school post, you talked about that social aspect, right? And some of you were talking more about the friendships, but some of you were talking about what we call socialization. So, sociology is the scientific study of society and human behavior. We examine how our social structure, that is, the organization of our society, and factors such as race and gender, operate to influence group behavior and individual choices. So, some social goals of education have been to regulate sexuality, to reduce crime, to improve children's health, to improve children's nutrition, and to create a sense of community. One thing to think about is what institutions were responsible for these goals prior to public schools, and what institutions are responsible for these goals now. So, slide 4. Little bit of history. So, Horace Mann, the father of common schools, yes, or public schools, yes. He thought that we could reduce crime through moral instruction. He said that universal education can counterwork a tendency to domination and servility and eliminate friction between the rich and the poor. And he was speaking specifically about white people, but we're going to apply that idea to everyone. John Dewey saw schools as social centers. John Dewey was a very influential educator and education philosopher. Schools as social centers, he thought that schools as social centers would replace brothels and saloons, which were a big problem back in his day. And thus, we have the auditorium, this idea that there could be a place where you could go and see a show instead of going to a brothel. Okay. And also, in the turn of the century, there's this idea that the whole child goes to school. So the children need recreation, they need health instruction, and they need nutrition. Okay. Slide 5. One thing to think about in terms of these social goals is this idea of religion versus secularism. So, secularism being non religious, right? Coming of age rituals is an example of this. So, coming of age rituals have been traditionally very important to societies, right? And so if you think of something like bar or bat mitzvah or quinceañera, right? These rituals, important for important aspects of societal groups, important milestones, right, for young people. And in a lot of ways, schooling has taken the place of those rituals. Um, yeah, so we have a shift from a religious focus to a more secular focus in communities where they're no longer practicing certain rituals that they did in the past. But sociologist Edward Ross in the 1890s had this idea that education is also for social control. Okay, we want to control young people, um, and we're teaching them moral values so they can internalize the social values that we have, right? We're teaching them moral values so they can internalize social control. In this, we have in the past, moral values were taught by your family and your church, right? And so he identified a decline of family and church and the rise of schools as who is transmitting these moral values. So, if you think of coming of age rituals moving from a church setting to a school setting, you think of the prom, right? And so I used to live in Malden, Massachusetts, and I lived right across the street from a high school. And I saw something that was very different from the my prom years ago. This was in May 2016. About a third of the students in at Malden High School are economically disadvantaged. Now, high school, it tends to be underreported because high schoolers don't return their free and reduced lunch forms, right? So it's probably more than that. Were financially struggling. And yes, I looked out the window and I see limos, and multiple limos arrived and to drop off kids at the prom. And the principal was wearing a tuxedo. And there were lots of parents taking pictures, and couples were walking through the balloon arch. And yes, that's two young ladies arriving together to the prom. And my mind was just blown because it was no way near this big a deal many years ago when I graduated from high school. And in talking with some of you here, I hear that it's similar at your schools. Is it a similar big deal at your high school? So this idea here, we had this coming of age ritual that used to take place in the church, but now with this transition from kid to grown up taking place in schools. Now, there are some questions, right? When you think about religion versus secularism. Well, who gets to teach moral values? And what moral values should be taught? So, prior to 1960, Christian values, including prayer and reading the Bible from the Bible, were taught in public schools, were used in public schools. In 1962, in a court case called Engel versus Vitale, the decision was that there should be no government sponsored prayer services. In 1963, in Abington School District versus Schempp, no reading the Bible as part of a religious exercise. Now, you can read it in history class, but not as part of a religious exercise. And in 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act, which was a conservative reauthorization of a federal education law, talked about constitutionally protected prayer. For example, prayer is you can pray in student clubs and teacher clubs, and kids can choose to write about religious figures. So this this division between religion versus secularism has been handled differently throughout the years in public schools. One controversial issue has been sex education, very controversial. In part, heightened teen sexuality was caused by the rise of public high school. You figure before there were public high schools, teens were working in factories. They were working in factories, they were mixed in with the adults, they're working all day. they're not put in they're not all put in this one place with hormones flying around all over the place. Um, um, so actually the rise of the public high school, while it benefited adults in that it took teens out of the workforce and made more jobs for adults, it actually heightened teen sexuality. So the prom was designed to rein in sexuality. Hey, here's an avenue where you all can dance and get out some of that sexual energy, right? One question, there had been a number of questions about what should be in the curriculum of sex sex education? Should abstinence be taught? Should condom use be advocated? Teen pregnancy actually has declined. In the 1980s, it was about 1 in 10. In 2010, it's about 1 in 20 in terms of the proportion of girls who are getting pregnant as teenagers. But watch out, things like chlamydia are on the rise, possibly because of a decline in the number of high schoolers who are actually getting a sex education course in their high school. Now, another issue that has come up in terms of the social goals of schooling is the idea of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning plus students, and what do they need, and what does everybody need to know, and how does that relate to values. So for example, in 1992 in New York City, there was a curriculum called Children of the Rainbow, and nowadays we think of the rainbow and we automatically associate it with LGBTQ, right? But this actually, it meant the rainbow more broadly. It was a curriculum to teach first graders to respect the city's myriad racial and ethnic groups. It offered teachers games, songs, and other lessons primarily to teach racial harmony. Now, among its 443 pages in the book that was basically the teacher guide, in a section on families, teachers were urged to include references to gay men and lesbians, right? Because they have families too, right? And there was a book suggested that's called Heather Has Two Mommies, which is a very famous children's book about a lesbian family, right? And it was just one part of this curriculum that was designed to teach kids about diversity, and there was a tremendous amount of controversy over this curriculum. Yes, a lot, and people were focused on the those couple of pages about teaching about alternative families in terms of that's what they were focused on in terms of opposition to the curriculum. So it was very controversial. In 2009, GLSEN, the Gay Lesbian Student Education, I gotta look that up. Um, anyway, I forget what it stands for, but it is a super important LGBTQ student advocacy organization. Now, they do a survey each year, and they found in their 2000, I think it's every year or every other year, something like that. They found in their 2009 survey that 91% of middle school students who identify as LGBTQ said that they were being verbally harassed in schools, and 39% said that they had been physically assaulted. So this survey really exposed kind of how much bullying is happening against LGBTQ kids when they're in schools. In 2010, in Itawamba County, Mississippi, there was a lesbian student who was told that she couldn't go to the prom, and she went to court and she won the case. Banning a same-sex prom date violates constitutional rights, right? So we have equal protection under the law, and we're going to talk about that. And students have equal protection under the law. We don't want to discriminate against any students. In 2014, Education Network, that's what it is, the Gay Lesbian Student Education Network. GLSEN and Crossroads Collaborative, they were looking at LGBTQ youth of color and gender nonconforming youth, and they found that they were not protected from bullies, that they were subject to harsh school discipline, and they recommended an actual or perceived sexual orientation as a protected class. Depending on what state a person lives in, that can determine the extent to which they're considered a protected class. And those who are in a protected class, those who are an identified minority, have um, have more protections against hate crimes and other unjust actions. So, other social goals include character education. It's less controversial. Most parents want it. Yes. I don't mind if the school teaches my child to be more kind and generous and that kind of thing. The laws are often vague. Caring, respect, responsibility, trustworthiness. These are some of the things that are taught in character education, but it's usually pretty vague. A goal to reduce crime. So, unfortunately, expanding schooling did not reduce crime rates overall, but better educated individuals are less likely to be incarcerated. Now, schools, then we have the problem of school crime. So, for example, we think of these tragic mass murders like Columbine, okay? And then there's also bullying and cyberbullying as school crimes. And of course, your typical property crimes, things going missing, that kind of thing. Okay. A social goal is national health. We want to improve nutrition, reduce obesity, reduce drug and alcohol abuse. And since kids are required to go to school in the US, it's a perfect place to try and teach some of these things because if people are unhealthy, they end up costing society more. Okay? Because we all are paying for people who have to use the emergency room. And if there are ways that we can help kids learn how to eat well and eat nutritionally and prevent some of these diseases that we pay for as a society, then that would be great. And finally, building community through extracurricular activities. So, and I think this was out of Dewey's push, but we're continuing to look at education, education history. This idea that, oh, hey, let's have the kids do sports together. Okay, we can build community among the kids, and we can unite the various parts of our society. We can unite the rich and the poor, for example, by kids going to school together and doing things together, like play sports and do other extracurricular activities. All right, so that is it for our brief discussion about social goals. See you next time.